Hello and welcome to the How to Get an Analytics Job podcast, where we will help you discover where you fit into the analytics marketplace, what skills you should build, and how to land your analytics dream job. I'm John David, analytics agency owner and educator.
And I'm Elizabeth Illig, a private career coach and higher education professional. In this podcast, we will not only help you land your next analytics job, but we will give you the tools and strategies to level up your career. Hi everyone, we are back with How to Get an Analytics Job, and I have with me John David, who we are going to talk to about building skills. We are entering our building skills theme this month, and so we're going to be talking with some amazing folks, starting with our very own John David. So John David, let's get started with, if someone is interested in building their analytics skills, what would you recommend?
So this is not a super cool answer, but I think you should start with Excel. And some of you listening here might kind of scoff at that and say, I've been working in Excel for years. Well, that's good news because that means that you have some basic analytic skills built into your skill set already. That being said, I think just being Excel proficient is almost like saying I can use PowerPoint. Like once you actually get into the analytics job market, you're going to want to upgrade from there. And I think the logical, most effective next step would be getting into data visualization. So tools like Tableau and Power BI. Actually, you could even get into like Google Data Studio and some of these other platforms as well. But just being able to turn these huge swaths of data into some data visualizations that provide insights are going to be, that's going to be hugely valuable to your manager, especially if they are in an industry that's not super tech forward. So like a manufacturer or even like a sales training company, they're not necessarily living in, day out with the data.
Great. So there are a lot of things that you can do to build your skills. And I agree, you have to start with Excel. You're right, even though that maybe doesn't sound super sexy to everybody out there, but you have to start with the first thing that is necessary. So great for us to know what we need to have in order to get into this field. I'm also curious because there's a lot of debate on the advantages of a traditional degree versus learning through a boot camp versus teaching yourself how to do some of these skills. And so what would be your take on that, John David, in terms of the advantages of each of these routes?
So we've actually pre-recorded this podcast with Billy Winbin, who is, that's actually not how to, Billy Zhao is what he goes by, but Billy Winbin is what his LinkedIn profile name is. He and I talk about this in detail. So stay tuned in the upcoming weeks because we're going to dive deep into this. But in short, I think it exists on a spectrum. So if you can think of a traditional degree, then a boot camp, and then a teaching, like self-taught path, the actual getting a university degree is the most expensive and the highest risk. And what I mean by that is you might get a degree from a university and not actually come out with any skills. I am the poster child for this because my undergrad, I got a degree in economics and I was pretty much unemployable. I had no specific knowledge. Now that's why I went back and got my MBA, and part of it, when I went back for my master's degree, I knew what was at stake. It was that 100% commission sales job that I'd have to go back to. So I took a more proactive stance at building skills within my master's program. Next, we have boot camps. And boot camps are kind of the in-between space in that they're a fraction of what a university costs, but you also have experts who are advising you on how to build out your skill set. So I think in terms of risk, it's moderately risky. So you might waste about $8,000 in a few months of your time. Now, at the very bottom, which is the lowest risk, is being self-taught. Now here, the only thing you're risking is just a few hours a week or a few hours a day that you're spending on these courses. You can actually use YouTube to find a bunch of free resources. In fact, I was talking to Tyler Lubin in one of the podcasts that's coming up in a few months about how he built his skill set, as he's also an analytics agency owner. And he uses YouTube quite a bit. So he'll have a specific problem and then search for it on YouTube. And a lot of times you just fall down these rabbit holes of suggested videos that's related to that. And then you can expand your skill set that way.
I completely agree that there are various risks involved with each of these options, but I am going to disagree on the university thing, and this may not shock you because I have worked for a couple of universities.
A non-biased opinion.
Non-biased opinion. I do think that there are some advantages to the university degree, but as you mentioned, John David, I want you guys to be really analyzing if that's the fit for you, because it is a commitment of time, energy, money, effort, all of those things. So you're right in that it could be a commitment of money in some ways. You could get a scholarship, which would be great. But I think major advantages of a university route is, one, the recruiting and networking that's available to you, but two, the professors that you may be learning from. So I think the recruiting and networking is really big because you can have these strong relationships with employers who may only recruit from those schools or may have specific relationships mapped out with those schools. And then you also have that alumni network. So you can say, hey, we both got this degree from X university, let's grab coffee, let's network, which is something we're going to talk about more, networking and upcoming episodes. But I think that for that reason, for the recruiting and networking piece, it's really can be beneficial to get that traditional degree, specifically if you're getting it in business analytics. Because if you're getting a master's degree in business analytics, you are going to learn the technical skills that you need. And you may actually get some real world experience through the degree, through a practicum course. So I think that could be an advantage there.
So I see your point, and I think there's a lot of validity to that. There seems to be a wide spectrum, though, of networks that you can plug into. For example, I mean, you're working at Wake Forest. That is a thriving, very strong name brand. I went to UNCG for my master's program, and I was pretty much on my own. I mean, I don't mean to, shoot UNCG in the foot in this, but I was literally the second cohort to go through their master's of business with a concentration in analytics. So they had just rolled out that program. Now, I mean, I went into consulting, so it wasn't that big of a deal for me, but a lot of the people that went through my cohort were really stressed out because it took them, sometimes 3 to 4 months to land that first job. And that job may not have been what they thought that they were going to get.
Sure. So I think this speaks to the value of researching some of your programs before you get into them. And I won't go into a ton of details here because it's getting us a little bit off path. But I would say that I used to advise and serve as a graduate school specialist where I advise students on applying to graduate programs. And I think number one thing you need to think about there is some of the things that you mentioned on John David, which is make sure you research the program. You understand what types of advantages there are to getting into that program, and you ask about what those alumni are doing post-graduation. So certain programs have a 100% placement rate, for example. That's a super high number. That means every person that goes to that program is employed within 6 months of getting their degree. So I want you to be doing your research if you decide that traditional degrees are the path that you want to take. Now, of course, John David mentioned some pros and cons to each of these ideas and methods, and I think you need to consider who you are as a person, what skills you bring to the table, how you learn best. If you're somebody that is not very good at learning on their own and really needs deadlines and that higher person who you're reporting to, like a professor, who is making sure that you're getting your things done, well, then self-teaching might not be the way for you to go. If you are super oriented to doing things with initiative and really are somebody who can do things on their own, then maybe self-teaching is the exact right thing for you. Or maybe you need to fall somewhere in the middle. But do be thinking about how do you learn best. If you are a person who learns best by learning on your own, go for it. If you are a person who really does well with structure and with some of those coursework structure that's available at a university program, then that might be the route for you. I think you just have to determine what's best.
Well, something that I wanted to touch on is this concept called specific knowledge. So, if you're in a university classroom setting, I'd say even at one of these, more name brand universities, the majority of what you're doing is you're sitting in a classroom and they are teaching you. I mean, I don't know, am I being controversial again?
I don't think you're being controversial. I think it depends on what the program is like. And many of these programs will have what's called a practicum component, where you do typically have to do a real world problem. So it depends on the university, but some will actually have companies they partner with who come in and say, here's a business problem, take your group of 5 students in this practicum and determine what we need to do with this problem.
Right. So getting back to specific knowledge, that practicum is specific knowledge. It's what you can show up to an interview and say, I did this thing for a company and it resulted in this much value. It's arguable if you should pay $84,000 for that. Granted, getting the skill set is pretty much free at this point. But getting that guidance that those higher tier universities give you, so it's kind of a balancing act. I paid $24,000 for my MBA. They did have a practicum, or we called it a capstone project. But what I did during my master's program was I nailed my internships. So I had 3 internships. 2 of them were with Volvo Trucks, where I got to work with a $12 billion company. And essentially what I learned out of that was I cannot work corporate. That gray drab cubicle culture is not for me. And part of that is because I didn't feel like I got to make a big enough impact. On my 3rd internship, I worked for a smaller manufacturing company that I think they're doing about $150 million in sales a year. But I was working directly with the owner. But there, I got to build out the entire Tableau infrastructure from soup to nuts. So now I took that and we actually pivoted that into my first consulting client. So that specific knowledge you can get through a university, and I feel like I'm sounding very biased and jaded against the university. I just worry because I think a lot of these universities, I'm seeing it on my own LinkedIn feed, are targeting me, and it's like maybe before spending that huge amount of money, really critically think what's the value proposition here. Because my buddy Danny actually got his MBA from Wake Forest, and he came out making I think $115,000 a year or something like that. So that return on investment was there for him. And now he got a job at Amazon and he moved to Melbourne, Australia. So he's killing it. And I think, actually, that's a pretty interesting story. Guess what he was doing before he went back to get his MBA?
What was he doing?
He was a male cheerleader for the Trailblazers.
Wow, what a career transition.
Yeah. So, I mean...
anything is possible.
Yeah, there is an argument and a stake for paying a lot of money for one of these more prestigious degrees.
Yeah, I think, again, there are so many factors, and John David and I cannot make this decision for you. We just want to give you as much information as possible so that you make the decision that works well for you. And I think there's pros and cons to any approach. Certainly, some of these brand name universities are going to open up a network that you wouldn't have access to without that university. Or perhaps you would have to do a lot more digging to find those people or to get in touch with them.
Right.
So there's some of that value.
You can build out a very robust network, but if you're introverted and a little bit shy and you don't want to go to a Tableau user meetup or all the different conferences, then maybe a university would be the right call for you because it's forcing you to build these relationships. And then at the end of the day, you have these, letters behind your name from an accredited university that makes you a part of a group. So there's a huge amount of value there.
Right. I think also to speak to your internship experience and what you were talking about with some of the great experience you got as an intern, I think in addition to whatever you decide, if you are able to do an internship in addition to that traditional learning or that self-taught, it really is a wonderful way to get practical hands-on experience, which is invaluable I think, as John David mentioned, this teaches you whether or not you see yourself in that particular role. And if not, it teaches you how to transition or think about, okay, I didn't love the corporate culture. Now what? Maybe I want to do more of this consulting thing where I have my own, deal, my own thing. So I think that certainly internship experience, in addition to whatever you do to build up your skills, to understand what's needed of you in this career, is important. And I think that your experience speaks to that.
Yeah, I actually did want to circle back around. We kind of got out of order. We had the internship question next, and I jumped ahead. The internships that I had during my master's degree program completely shifted the whole trajectory of my life. So when I went to get my MBA, I was almost in that kind of scarcity mindset of I'll take any job I can get. But then I got to work in that corporate environment, and I really shouldn't be so negative on that, in that working corporate is a very secure income source. And the trade-off is that, you're locked into that hierarchy. You have a direct report manager, and if you don't get along with them, like I didn't, maybe I was just a bad roll of the dice. I didn't really get along with either of my managers in my internship at Volvo, then it's not a very pleasant work environment. So that's actually the risk there, is that you get stuck in that position. And another thing on a whole little tangent here, you want to be careful that you don't become so valuable to the system and the hierarchy that you can't get promoted. I actually worked with a guy who was pigeonholed into his role and he couldn't move up.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah. But so those 2 internships were crucial in understanding myself. It's almost like that, Clifton Strength Finders 2.0, actually applied to the real world. And then this third internship, this is a pretty fascinating story, and I think I should tell this narrative just to give you some ideas. I took this internship interview kind of reluctantly because it was really designed for an undergrad, maybe a sophomore or a junior. So the opportunity was, this manufacturer wanted an intern to come in and build out very simple charts and graphs in Excel. And they were going to analyze one of their 17 assortments. And that was a whole internship. Over that 3-month period, you're going to get to work with the owner of the company, and you're going to analyze one assortment. So this is where my specific skills of being somewhat entrepreneurial and also having some sales skills, I showed up to that interview with an alternate pitch, essentially. So I showed up to that interview and said, hey, listen, instead of doing this in Excel, where it's going to take me, a bunch of hours to build out these very kind of tedious, detailed graphs, and it's prone to human error, let me build you out a Tableau infrastructure, and I can automate not only this process, but we can scale it up 17 times. So over that 3-month period of the last semester of my MBA, I built out the entire infrastructure. And what's kind of cool is I'm still managing that project today. So this is a long-term project, and we've actually just expanded it. And that internship is a huge opportunity for you to actually meet other professionals who need analytics help, but then also build that skill set. So I leveraged that opportunity to learn Tableau. I mean, full disclosure, I had never even touched Tableau before that internship. And I mean, I was pretty open about that, in that, hey, this is my plan. I think I can pull this off in 3 months.
No big deal.
Yeah, fortunately it worked out.
Fortunately,
right?
it worked. I think you bring up a couple of good points here. First and foremost, I would say you don't have to take the shiny, big name internship. It doesn't always have to be that. You can look to some of these smaller businesses where, you might get the opportunity to work with the CEO, which is amazing. So that could be a really cool opportunity to build your skills in a way that perhaps some of these other internship opportunities wouldn't give you that ability to do so. The second thing here is John David took a lot of initiative in saying to this person, to the CEO, hey, you want an intern for this, but I think I could do this better, and here's how. And I think that's one thing that employers are really looking for when we're talking about soft skills, which we'll get into in a little bit. They want you to be taking initiative and have that work ethic to say, here are the things that I think we could implement to improve your business. So a couple of good things there. Don't always be afraid of having an internship that isn't a brand name. Of course, we love some of these big brand name Fortune 500 companies. Those are great, wonderful, but there can also be opportunities at smaller companies where you get hands-on experience with somebody really high up. So those can be wonderful. And then the importance of taking some initiative. I think also internships are an opportunity for you to build amazing skills because you get that real-world experience. I know in previous episodes, John David, we talked about, especially in our discovery episode where we were doing an introduction to that theme, we made this distinction between a data scientist and a business analyst and how those are really two separate areas in this field. And so I want to dive into that a little bit more. What skills do you think somebody who's interested in becoming a data scientist should have? And then what skills do you think somebody who's interested in becoming a business analyst should have?
So I'm in a pretty interesting interesting spot here to talk about this because my agency, Silvertone Analytics, actually has 2 data scientists that consult for us. So we bring the data scientist in when they need like a predictive model built out or something that needs some advanced coding or some deep mathematics. So data scientists focus more so on that deeper learning, sometimes machine learning, predictive modeling, to where they don't necessarily understand the business need as well as I do. So I'm a business analyst. I understand sales and marketing deeply, and I can understand it well enough that I can condense it down, bring in my data scientist, tell him the predictive model that he needs to build, and then make the end client happy. So the skills that I need to know is what are the KPIs for sales and marketing and understand the initiatives there and what an effective marketing campaign looks like and what are the metrics there, you know?
I think there's a major difference here because one, as you mentioned, is much more technical. We're thinking more about using some of these coding skills or being able to do things that maybe a business analyst isn't necessarily skilled in doing, but the business analyst is making that case for what's the business need, how can I solve that business need. Would that feel accurate?
Yeah, that feels pretty accurate. I wanted to highlight though, in terms of skill building, it's so much easier to build your analytics tool set to where a data scientist is going to need to learn coding, essentially. I don't think there's a way around that. And learning coding is almost like learning a new language or learning an instrument. It's going to take you years to not only nail the basics, but then start to be able to, like, you know, using a silly metaphor, make music with it. You know, to like actually, because a data scientist works in a much more kind of vague and foggy environment where they're trying to bring in multiple data sources together to come up with a sophisticated solution. To where a data analyst, if you can understand what are the sales KPIs, you can even build that out in Excel and have a dashboard or report that your sales manager can use to help guide a sales team, and that can be worth quite a bit of money for them.
Right. So just differences. Both are valuable. Both are wonderful routes to go, but the data scientist does require a little bit more in terms of technical knowledge. And so that's something to be aware of. And perhaps you will be plugging in a little bit of a different way than a business analyst would be. I think we also want to touch on some soft skills, right, John David?
Yeah, I think that soft skills are incredibly important, and they're harder to nail down. It's much easier for me to say, oh yeah, I can build a line graph in Excel, or I could build a pivot table. But trying to say, oh, I can effectively communicate, I mean, that's a little bit more, I don't know. Nebulous, yeah, exactly. Right. I'm failing at the skill that I'm talking about. How meta.
That's great.
But something that I did want to talk about in terms of soft skills, so I think you should have some communication, or even more specifically, you need to be able to persuade and lead. So a lot of times that when I'm working with my clients or when I was in my internships working with managers, I had to get buy-in on the project, because if they didn't give me the okay, and I guess I see it with my clients now, if they don't see the value, then they're just not going to actually move forward with the project. And furthermore, I think in terms of soft skills, you should start to stack your skills together. So your communication soft skills should stack on top of you actually being able to do like the analytics behind it. And then you start to stack these skills on top of each other until you're providing a huge amount of value that no one else in the organization is providing. So that gives you some of that security.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to this, we see on the National Association of Colleges and Employers, every year they do a survey with employers to understand what are the soft skills that they're looking for in graduates at this point. And they have a top 10 list every year. The most recent one, of course, is 2019. And there are a ton of top soft skills on this top 10 list. We have communication, particularly written, which John David was talking about. We also have problem solving, working on a team, initiative, work ethic, verbal communication, leadership, and detail orientation. So you guys notice that isn't exactly 10 because the other skills are technical, but many of the top skills that employers are looking for are really on the soft end of the spectrum, these soft skills. And so being able, as John David mentioned, to convey your message in a concise and impactful way, both in your writing and in your verbal communication, is really important, because if you don't have the buy-in, you're not going to be able to do what you need to get done. Also, the initiative that we were talking about that John David took in his internship, that's really important. And even things like being able to work on a team or showing that you have the work ethic necessary to do the role, these are all things that you want to be cultivating. They are a little more nebulous, a little harder for us to maybe pinpoint, but there's certainly things that you want to be thinking about, which we'll talk about in interviewing when we will tackle that subject in a few weeks. You want to be thinking about how you can convey that you have these skills to an employer. So thinking about stories that showcase your problem-solving abilities, your initiative, your ability to communicate. And certainly those are things that our employers are looking for in addition to some of these technical skills.
Awesome. Well, I think that pretty much wraps things up for today. But coming up later in the month, we're going to be continuing to focus on building skills. So next week, we have Billy Zhao coming on to talk about in depth the difference between a classical education versus a boot camp versus a self-taught. And I would really suggest that you tune in for that, because he's got an interesting perspective in that he actually recently went through UT Austin's boot camp and got a new analytics job. Then in 2 weeks, we're going to be interviewing Tyler Lubin, who is incredible. He is literally traveling around the world running his analytics agency remotely. And we talk about how he learned his skills. And the way that he went about doing that was just taking on new projects and expanding out his skill set by just doing the project that was outside of his reach. Kind of like how when I took on my third internship, I just took that project on and then the skills kind of came secondary because there was no choice. I literally had to get that done. And then the last week of the month, we're going to be talking to Kinsley Frazier, who she recently finished up her master's of business administration and landed her first job. But the trick here, which is kind of interesting, she did an interview. She literally turned her internship into a job. And they didn't even ask her for her resume or anything because she had such a strong relationship with her hiring manager. All right, well, thanks.
Thanks for tuning in.